In 1928, 3 men broke into a farmhouse in Pennsylvania. They weren't thieves and they weren't killers, at least not at first. They believed that the old man inside this house had put a curse on him, and the only way to lift this curse was to take his magical book and a lock of his hair. But then things escalated really quickly, and when their plan failed, they panicked. By morning, one of the men were dead, and what followed became one of the strangest murder cases in American history. A killing completely blamed on witchcraft. This is the story of the Hex Murder. If you're a fan of this kind of content, then you're definitely in the right place. If you enjoy horror, the creepy, the unsettling, the disturbing, then don't forget to subscribe to my channel. I post new videos every week. So to understand how a murder could be blamed on witchcraft in 1928, we have to go way, way back. Back more than 200 years ago in the early days of Pennsylvania, when German settlers, often called the Pennsylvania Dutch, came to the colony, they brought more than just farming tools and their language. More importantly, they brought tradition. Blended together with Christianity, their traditions formed a very unique system of folk magic called powwowing. Now, powwowing had nothing to do with Native American ceremonies. It was a form of healing, prayers, charms, and rituals that people swore could cure fevers, protect cattle, and even find lost objects. For generations and generations, families passed down these recipes for cures like treasured heirlooms. And to most people in rural Pennsylvania, it wasn't strange or sinister, it was just simply a part of life. But here's where it gets a little bit unsettling. Right alongside powwowing was something a little bit darker, something called hexery. And this was witchcraft. While powwowers claimed to draw their power from God, people using witchcraft claimed to draw their power from the devil. And in farming communities, witches were blamed for everything. Cows that wouldn't give milk, crops that failed, children who were wasted away for no reason, you name it, witches were blamed. To outsiders in the Roaring Twenties, this of course sounded very ridiculous. America was modernizing and cities were booming. But in the isolated hollows of Pennsylvania, the line between healer and witch was thinning. And the belief in curses was a very real thing. People carried charms, amulets, and even little handwritten Bible verses folded into small triangles around with them, all to ward off evil invisible forces. So powwowing and hexery were two sides of the same coin. On the one side you had the powwowers, and these were people who prayed over the sick, read out Bible verses into wounds, and handed out protective charms. They were very respected people in the community, even quite loved. People believed that they could heal a fever, heal a wound, and even drive away bad luck. But on the other side, there was the hexery, the witches, the hex doctors. These were the ones said to draw their power from the devil. They were feared, and like I said earlier, when anything went wrong, they were the first people that were blamed. If anything went wrong, the first thing they would say was that the witches had cursed us. And here's the really weird part as well. Sometimes a person could be seen as both a healer and a witch. A powwower who knew way too much about hexery could be seen as quite suspicious. People would seek them out to remove curses over themselves, but they also believed that those very same hands that removed the curses could also create them. And if you were desperate enough, you may even pay a hex doctor to cast a spell of revenge on your behalf. The result was a society just constantly caught in the middle of these two people, where every sickness, every curse, every blessing had a supernatural explanation. It was a world where an argument with your neighbor might suddenly end with your cows not giving you any milk or your child falling sick with an illness. So in the world of powwowing, knowledge was everything. Families would pass down handwritten recipe books filled with charms, prayers, and cures. But eventually 2 books would rise above all of the others, one seen as holy and one seen as cursed. The first was called The Long Lost Friend. First published in 1819 by John George Homan, it was a very strange mix of remedies, prayers, and folk magic. Inside were cures for fevers, charms to protect livestock, and even just random recipes for beer and molasses. And here's the eerie part. The book itself was seen to be a talisman. Owners believed that simply carrying the book on them could keep them from drowning, burning, or even dying without Christ at their side. For many powwowers, The Long Lost Friend wasn't just a manual or a book, it was quite literally their shield against the darkness. And then there was the opposite, the evil book that I spoke about earlier, the 6th and 7th book of Moses. This one was whispered about in very hushed tones. It claimed to contain lost secrets written by Moses himself, instructions for summoning spirits, duplicating biblical plagues, and even controlling demons. Unlike the long-lost friend, this book was seen as dangerous. Some said even just simply owning it would invite the devil's attention. And if you dared to read it, people believed that you would be entirely consumed with an obsession until the only way out was to read the entire book backwards. For the Pennsylvania Dutch, these two books represented the very thin line between faith and fear, healing and harm. And when John Blymer began to believe that he was cursed, it was only natural that these very books and the old stories of powwowing and hexery loomed very large in his mind. Because soon he would be convinced that the only way to break his curse was to take a copy of Long Lost Friend from a man named Nelson Rehmeyer. And this was the making of the Hex Murder. John Blymer was born in 1895 in York County, Pennsylvania, into a family of powwowers. Healing was in his blood. He was said to be the 7th son, born from the 7th son, which was a sign of a special power. And by the time he was 7 years old, he was already treating neighbors with charms and prayers, and people swore that his touch alone could cure them of anything. But for all of his early promise, John unfortunately did carry a shadow. And one story captures it perfectly. One day, while working at a cigar factory, John and his co-workers were suddenly charged by a rabid dog. The dog was foaming at the mouth and snapping at everyone in sight. But when John stepped forward, he muttered a charm under his breath, and the dog just stopped, just like that. The foam dried, his eyes cleared, and the dog began to follow him obediently down the street. To all of the witnesses around them, it literally looked like a miracle. But miracles come with a price, and not long after that incident, John's luck began to collapse. He fell ill, unable to sleep, unable to eat, and worst of all, he said that he couldn't use his powers anymore. To John, there was only one explanation. Someone must have hexed him. From then on, paranoia simply took over his life. There's no other way to explain it. He carried protective charms, recited counterspells, even moved away from his childhood home because he believed that the spirit of his great-grandfather was tormenting him. And for a little while, things did seem to improve in his life. He married a woman named Lily, and together they had 2 children. But then tragedy struck again. Both of his children died in early childhood, one of them surviving only 3 days. For most families, the grief would probably be completely unbearable. But for John, it was just simply proof that someone had definitely hexed him. And from that point onwards, John Blymer was completely consumed. Every setback, every illness, and every misfortune, all of it was evidence that someone had cursed him. And eventually, he became convinced that he knew exactly who had cursed him. A distant relative, a fellow powwower, a man named Nelson Rehmeyer, one that I mentioned earlier. By the early 1920s, John Blymer's life was completely unraveling. His wife, who was terrified of his obsession with all of these curses, had him admitted to a mental hospital. Doctors wrote that he was completely fixated on witchcraft and hexes, and just after 48 days, John just simply walked out of the front door and disappeared. No one came looking for him. For a time, he drifted. He went back to the cigar factory to work quietly until he met 2 other people who, like him, believed that they had been hexed. One was a teenager named John Curry, and he was trapped in an abusive home and convinced a curse was behind his suffering. The other was Milton Hess, a farmer whose once prosperous life had just completely collapsed. His crops failed, his cows stopped producing milk, his family lost all their money, and to him it could only mean one thing: witchcraft. Together, the 3 men, of course, just fed each other all of their fears, each of them telling their stories, and each story reinforcing the idea that dark forces were targeting them. But they did need confirmation. So John Blymer turned to Nellie Knoll, an elderly powwower known as the River Witch of Marietta. When he asked her who had cursed him, she placed a dollar bill in his hand. After a moment, she lifted it, and according to John, the face of his tormentor appeared on the palm of his hand. And it was Nelson Rehmeyer. Rehmeyer wasn't a stranger to John. He was family. He was a distant relative and a very respected powwower in his own right. Years earlier, he had even cured Blymer when others couldn't. But now, Nellie Knoll declared him the Witch of Rehmeyer's Hollow. She told John that the only way to break the curse was to take Rehmeyer's copy of The Long Lost Friend, that very powerful book of charms that I spoke about, along with a lock of his hair and bury them 6 feet underground. And so, convinced that his life depended on it, Blymer gathered John Curry and Milton Hess's teenage son, Wilbert, and together they headed for Rehmeyer's farmhouse in the wooded hollow. And what happened next would horrify Pennsylvania and shock the entire nation. On a cold November night in 1928, John Blymer and the 14-year-old John Curry walked up the dirt road that led to Nelson Rehmeyer's house. The house sat in a very lonely patch of woods, very dark, very quiet, with only the wind moving through the hollow. At first, the plan wasn't murder. They told themselves that they just needed the book, The Long Lost Friend, and a lock of Rehmeyer's hair. That was it. Take those items, bury them underground, and the curse would be gone. When Rehmeyer opened the door, he of course very kindly let them into the house, no problems. He was a distant relative. They sat in the parlor and talked very late into the evening. Rehmeyer was older, larger, and far stronger than either of them, and Blymer quickly realized that they couldn't overpower him alone. So they spent the night sleeping on his floor, and then the next morning they planned to return with more help. The following evening, they went back to his house. This time, they brought Wilbert Hess with him, just 18 years old. Once again, Rehmeyer opened the door and kindly let them in, but this time there would be no polite conversation. As Rehmeyer turned his back, the men immediately leapt on him, trying to force him to the ground. He fought hard, too hard for them to manage quietly. In the chaos, ropes were thrown around his legs, fists were raised, and eventually Rehmeyer was beaten and strangled until he lay completely still on the floor. The plan had gone completely off the rails. They hadn't taken his hair or the book. They literally just murdered a man and left him dead in his own home. In a panic, they just grabbed the cash from his pockets to make it look like some sort of robbery. Then, in one final act of desperation, they doused his body with kerosene and lit it on fire, hoping that the blaze would erase their crime completely. But it didn't. Somehow, the flames just sputtered out and Rehmeyer's half-burned body was still on the floor. Days later, a neighbor found the very gruesome scene, and the Hex Murder was born. And when the truth came out that the killers believed that they were cursed, that they had been hunting a magic book and a very specific lock of hair, the press completely exploded. Across America, headlines screamed of witchcraft, hex doctors, and murder in the Pennsylvania hills. What once had been seen as just harmless folk healing each other was now branded as dangerous superstition, and the panic was only just beginning. When Nelson Rehmeyer's body was found, the discovery sent shockwaves through York County. Rehmeyer's corpse was still half burned, ropes knotted around his body. It didn't look like a robbery, it looked very ritualistic. Police very quickly tracked down the people who were last seen with him, and that was of course John Blymer and John Curry. Once in custody, the story just completely spilled out of them. They told the police that they believed Rehmeyer had hexed him, that he was a witch. And they admitted that they had gone into his house specifically to steal a lock of his hair and his book, The Long Lost Friend. And this was all to break the curse that he had supposedly put on them. The press had an absolute field day. Newspapers across the country branded it the York Witchcraft Murder. They described Blymer as a man completely consumed by superstition, a folk healer who turned killer because of magic. Reporters painted rural Pennsylvania as a place stuck in the Dark Ages, where farmers still whispered about witches and carried charms to ward off evil. The courtroom became a stage. Testimony about hex doctors and protective amulets left city goers stunned. In the end, Milton Hess, whose son Wilbert had helped tie Rehmeyer down, received 10 years in prison. Blymer and Curry were sentenced to life in prison. Both men would eventually be paroled, but their names were forever tied to witchcraft and murder. The Rehmeyer case could have ended with 3 men in prison, but instead, suddenly every tragedy in Pennsylvania's backroads were being labeled as a hex murder. In 1929, the body of a young woman named Verna Delp was found in the woods near Allentown. On her were scraps of paper covered in protective charms. The The coroner did find poison in her body, but instead of treating it as a suicide or a botched abortion, police zeroed in on a local powwower. They arrested him, insisting that he was behind another Hex murder. The charges did eventually collapse in court, but by then, newspapers had already run the story, headlines linking the death to witchcraft. In the next year, a Reading housewife named Mrs. Harry MacDonald died horribly when her body caught fire near her stove. Reporters claimed that she had been using some sort of magical ointment that she received from a hex doctor, and that it must have been flammable. Again, no proof, but that did not stop the press from calling it an occult death. Then, in 1932, an accountant named Norman Bechtel was found stabbed 9 times, his face slashed with very strange crescent-shaped cuts. Detectives whispered that these wounds might carry occult significance, and when the press learned that he had actually grown up in an area where powwowing was quite common, the case was splashed across newspaper headlines as another hex murder. Only years later would police uncover the truth. Bechtel had been killed during a blackmail scheme. Witchcraft had absolutely nothing to do with it. But by then, the damage had already been done. To the public, Pennsylvania was completely crawling with witches. Every unexplained death, every grisly accident was linked back to hexery. And then in 1934 came a murder that seemed to confirm everyone's worst fears. The very last hex murder in Pennsylvania. On March 17th in 1934, 63-year-old Susan Mummy was tending to a boarder in her farmhouse near Pottsville. Her adopted daughter stood nearby holding a lamp. Without warning, a shotgun blast tore through the window, completely shattering the glass in the light. Susan collapsed on the floor, dead. At first, police thought that it was just a simple feud, but soon a young man named Albert Shimsky confessed. His reason had shocked everyone. He said that Susan had hexed him 7 years earlier after a property dispute, and ever since he claimed he had been tormented by visions. The worst was a black cat with flaming eyes. Shinsky swore that whenever he saw sharp objects, they would transform into this vision of a cat. At night, it crept across his room and leapt onto his bed, chilling him to the bone until he had to run around just to get warm again. No powwow could cure him, and no doctor believed him. Finally convinced that the only way to end his torment was kill her, he took a shotgun and fired through her window. And the moment she died, he said, the curse lifted. Prosecutors wanted the death penalty, but doctors ruled Shinsky insane. He was committed to a state hospital where he would spend the rest of his life. For the public though, again, the damage was done. 2 murders, Rehmeyer in 1928 and Mummy in 1934, with countless other murders labeled as hex killings in between. After the murder of Susan Mummy, powwowing was no longer seen as a quirky old tradition. To the outside world, it was a threat. Schools in Pennsylvania launched campaigns to stamp out superstition, teaching children that hexes and charms were backwards and very dangerous. Doctors and law enforcement even came together to prosecute powwowers for practicing medicine without a license. The effect was quite devastating. Many powwowers closed their doors or just went underground. Some continued their work very quietly, passing charms and healing prayers to neighbors, but always in secret, always careful not to draw attention. Younger generations were much less interested to learn these traditions, and slowly they all faded. But it never vanished completely. Even today, tucked away in rural Pennsylvania, there are still people who practice this form of healing. For them, it's about faith, family, and the power of belief. So for generations and generations, powwowers were seen as completely harmless. But in the 1920s and 30s, beliefs and curses turned people deadly. And the scariest part is these people truly believed to their core that they had been hexed, and the only way to stop it is to murder someone. That is how obsessed and how all-consuming this witchcraft and this hexery was. They believed in magic deep enough to kill for it, which I think is pretty insane, which I think is pretty scary. But yeah, what a case. I think that this is probably one of the most interesting cases that I've ever looked into. The fact that witchcraft and belief can get someone to murder another human is just wild to me. But it happened, it's true, and luckily we don't live in a world where witchcraft is a very common thing, because I think that would probably scare me. But let me know what you think about this case. Please drop some comments in the comment box down below. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to drop a like, and if you like this kind of thing, please do subscribe. I will see you next week. Bye.